Okay, and we are now live as Edith is joining us. So it's my pleasure today to welcome for the third session of our Vanderbilt Modern Philosophy Spring Seminar series of 2024, right? Time is weird. 2024, or as we call it sometimes, year 4 post-pandemic. We have today Leonardo Moauro, who is joining us from the Humboldt-Universität Berlin, and he will present Mereology and Laws of Nature in Spinoza. So please join me in welcoming Leonardo.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Emanuele, for organizing this meeting. And I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about these ideas in Spinoza and how they're sort of coming together. First, before I begin, are we on the same page? Can we all see the PowerPoint? Good. Okay, so my talk today will be about Mereology and Laws of Nature in Spinoza. A brief overview of the talk. So my goal here is to motivate a reading of Spinoza's conception of what laws of nature are, not specific laws of nature, but what a law of nature in general could be. And it's one that I think intersects in an interesting way with principles in his Mereology and his views about sort of the way that mereological principles structure the nature of finite things, what Spinoza will call modes. We'll get into it in a second. So I'll begin with a small introduction to sort of why we're interested in the laws of nature, why we're interested in Spinoza in particular. Then I'll canvass 2 different readings of what laws of nature are in Spinoza, and I'll sort of suggest that both are both are lacking in some ways, or both are incomplete, both need further support. I'll then introduce sort of Spinoza's Mereology as a potential, source of support for a particular reading of his conception of what the laws of nature are. And I'll, this will culminate in a presentation of what I'll call a nested natures model, right? So to anticipate, I think there is evidence to suggest that Spinoza believes that the entire physical universe, we're going to talk about physical things right now, for Spinoza, of course, there's an entire mental universe as well that we'll leave to the side for a second. That for Spinoza, the physical universe consists in a single infinite individual, these are his words, a single thing, physical thing, which then includes in it as parts, right, in a sort of multiple tiered strata, the entirety of the entirety of finite physical things. So within this I'm going to present this nested natures model as a way to explain what I believe Spinoza thinks laws of nature are, right? And where they're located, the way they govern, right? The way they regulate and structure the interaction among physical bodies, etc. But the bad news is that, at least as I understand things currently, this leads to a puzzle. The nested natures model can't succeed as I will currently present it, because of other things that Spinoza says about mereological relations. In particular, just to anticipate again, it seems that for Spinoza, the part is always prior to the whole, both in nature and in understanding. This is a traditional view. So Spinoza seems to affirm this principle. At the same time, the nested natures model, as I will show, seems to rely on the opposite claim, that the whole is prior in nature and understanding with respect to its parts. And so I present this puzzle, and then I suggest some ways we might go about resolving it. But ultimately, I don't think to have resolved it. I just point out some ways that we might think, maybe you can help me here. Point out some ways of, trying to reconcile what I think of as these two, these two positions in Spinoza that perhaps ultimately are in tension with one another. But without further ado, let's begin. So So first of all, some motivation for what we're talking about here. So why laws of nature? Why are we interested in laws of nature, in particular in the modern period? Well, the modern period in the 17th century in particular, really we might think of as the century of natural laws, right? It's a century, and to a large extent, this goes hand in hand, at least in Europe, with the scientific revolution. It's a century that begins with Giordano Bruno's burning at the stake in Rome for proposing, sort of in part for proposing views of nature that were at odds with, Catholic, at the time, Catholic orthodoxy. It's the century that sees Galileo first with his observations of the moons of Jupiter. A whole host of other scientific, it sees the rise of experimental philosophy with Robert Boyle, and eventually the culmination, perhaps, in Newton's Principia, right? So, which is for the modern period, sort of the canonical textbook of the way that nature operates, and sort of sets the agenda for the growth of the sciences after that. So it's a growth of the sciences that that leads us to the modern day. So the idea that physical nature is governed by a finite, perhaps, set of laws is central to scientific enterprise today. Whether that enterprise, is aims at discovering what these laws are or making them more precise, or whether this enterprise uses these laws as a background in sort of other projects, sort of identifying particular mechanisms to explain particular phenomena. Assess the reliability or plausibility of different hypotheses to explain observations. Laws of nature are central to the way that science is practiced today, and this, to a great extent, begins in the 17th century context. It is not limited to the birth of natural science, though. It's not limited to the scientific revolution. Philosophers in the 17th century had an enormously important role to play in this development, in this movement toward a laws of nature model, we might call it, of an understanding of physical nature. Descartes, whose it might be anachronistic to think about, or it might sound strange now to think about Cartesian science, but in the 17th century, Descartes' physical science vied for many decades and ultimately lost to Newton's physical science, but was considered at the time, perhaps by many, perhaps the most plausible explanation of the nature of the physical and the nature of physical interactions. Descartes, to the best of my knowledge, is the first person who offered a finite set of laws of nature that was meant to apply universally to the physical universe. And this set of laws of nature, this idea that the physical universe is governed, is regulated, is regimented, right, by a strict finite set of laws, came to displace within philosophy and within the sciences an older idea, right? An idea that sort of begins in Aristotle and it reaches perhaps its fullest extent in medieval scholasticism, that understands nature not as a physical universe governed and regulated by laws that apply in the same way everywhere, but rather understand nature as composed of finite particulars, each of which has its own laws that apply locally, right? And so explanations in a scholastic Aristotelian universe, or a scholastic Aristotelian understanding of the universe, to the best of my knowledge, almost never advert to laws or principles that apply universally everywhere without exception. Rather, they advert to the laws of particular things, right? So they advert to, not the laws, the natures of particular things. The reason that a particular human being or the reason that human beings create, for example, the societies that we do, is located, the explanation for that phenomenon is to be located in human nature, which each and every one of us instantiates in a particular way. It's not to be located in a set of universal laws of nature that apply to human beings as well as to other physical systems. If you believe, of course, that human beings are physical systems alone or also involve physical systems. But we're going to be talking about Spinoza here. So I think it's safe to say that we can talk about human beings also as physical systems. Okay, so in the 17th century, we have this displacement of an old, what now appears to us as an older way of thinking about nature and the way that it's regulated, an older way of offering explanations of phenomena in nature, right? The one based on powers. And this, as I was saying, is displaced by a new understanding of explanations in nature, in physical nature, one that relies on this concept of a law of nature. Now, Spinoza, to get to the second column, is an interesting figure, I think, in this transition, because on the one hand, he fully supports, at least in rhetorically in words, he fully supports the shift to the laws of nature. So the language of the laws of nature is present throughout Spinoza's corpus. Spinoza seems, on the face of it, to be a committed Cartesian in this sense, and that would make sense for him. Just historically, thinking about Spinoza's, his philosophical influences, Descartes features prominently among them, and his philosophical activity, right? So Spinoza is the only work published in his name during his lifetime was roughly a textbook or a rational reconstruction of Descartes' sort of philosophy and natural science. And yet, I think there's evidence that Spinoza arguably held an anti-Cartesian view of the laws of nature. And so it's difficult to simply say that Spinoza is carrying on this project that arguably Descartes is among those that Descartes gets started among other people, of moving away from a more sort of Aristotelian scholastic understanding of nature and the way it operates to one that will eventually culminate in Newton's Principia. But his anti-Cartesianism, as I advertised earlier, I think leads to a deep and interesting puzzle in his metaphysics. Okay, but before we begin with that, this is the last preliminary. Just very roughly, just so we're all on the same page, I wanted to give a little bit of a recap of Spinoza's ontology, just so we all know what we'll be talking about later on. As simply as possible, Spinoza thinks there are really just three kinds of being, right? There are just three kinds of things, right? So Spinoza's ontology is populated by a single substance, right? So and for Spinoza, a substance is something that depends on and is understood through itself, right? It's that of which things can be predicates. A kind of the concept has an Aristotelian lineage, but of course Spinoza uses it and introduces new content to it such that it becomes sort of distinctively his. So a substance is that which roughly exists most fundamentally for Spinoza, right? It depends on itself, it is understood through itself, so it doesn't need anything else to exist. It doesn't need anything else to be understood. And, right, famously, Spinoza says, there is only one such thing, and that thing is God. Attributes are roughly the essence of substance, what a mind perceives of as constituting the nature of substance. And this introduces sort of a whole literature in Spinoza that I leave to greater minds than my own to sort out. But for our purposes today, all we need to really know is that for Spinoza, God and all that follows from God can be understood either under the attribute of extension, roughly physical nature, or under the attribute of thought, roughly the mind and the mind's understanding of nature. I'm going to leave the mind out of a lot of what follows. So for our purposes, we could think of Spinoza's ontology under the physical purely as the claims that there is one absolutely infinite thing, one absolutely infinite extended substance, and finally, to get to the third category, modes, things that depend on that substance and are understood through that substance. And here the model that Spinoza begins from, arguably, according to many, is the model of the properties of subjects, right? So modes can be thought of as things that are ways of substance to be or properties of substance. In the secondary literature, there are much more refined views that I'm sort of giving credit to here, but for our purposes here, that's all we need to think about this. So again, for Spinoza, there is one substance. It doesn't depend on anything. It's understood through itself. And there are an infinity of modes, all of which depend on substance and must be understood through substance. And finally, substance just is God. Okay, so modes themselves for Spinoza are categorized into two types. There are modes that are infinite, and there are modes that are finite. And again, I'm limiting this to sort of the talk of extension. So I'm limiting this to Spinoza's understanding of physical nature. Infinite modes for Spinoza, he doesn't really say much about them. He gives us two examples throughout his corpus. He says, motion and rest is an infinite mode, or the face of the whole universe, tantalizingly, or arguably what he elsewhere calls the infinite individual is an infinite mode. But the basic idea here, at least, again, to sort of elide over many scholarly controversies, seems to be that infinite modes express properties or things that are sort of present everywhere, right? So infinite modes, take motion and rest, for example. You can't understand, Spinoza would say, the rest of physical nature without having some concept of what motion and rest is, right? And so if motion and rest is an infinite mode, then this mode has sort of a distinctive status among modes in that it sort of is necessary to explain what it is to be, as we'll get to in a second, a body, right? A finite physical thing. And finally, to get to the last sort of category here, the second subdivision of modes are finite modes. And here we'll just advert to your ordinary experience, tables, chairs, that will do for now. So those for Spinoza are all finite modes, right? And so they, importantly, they also must be understood through God and depend on God, the one substance. Now, within this ontology, when we're thinking about the laws of nature, a question arises, right? So how are physical interactions among things, finite things, paradigmatically, according to Spinoza, how are these physical interactions explained? We observe phenomena in nature, we observe change, we observe arguably things causing, determining other things. What is going on when this happens, according to Spinoza? Okay, so here hopefully is where this, not so brief introduction to Spinoza's metaphysics will prove useful. So in the literature, there are, roughly speaking, two broad views of what laws of nature are in Spinoza. So first of all, Spinoza seems to think that there are laws of nature that govern or describe these physical interactions that I was talking about. But it's unclear in Spinoza what exactly these laws of nature amount to, right? How should we think of their status within his ontology, for example? This is sort of the question that the talk begins with. So for a long time, dominant reading is what I'll call the Cartesian or concurrentist reading, proposed, I think, for the first time, or at least most completely, by Ed Curley. And this reading is sort of very simple, and it's very simple and orderly. So we saw earlier the distinction between infinite and finite modes in Spinoza. Curley says the infinite modes for Spinoza are the laws of nature, right? And as I said earlier, that the infinite modes seem to have a special status, seem in some sense to be present everywhere, right? There's nowhere in the physical nature that is not somehow sort of explicable or is not somehow related to an infinite mode. Curley then says this is because the infinite modes just are the laws of nature, right? And so they're laws of nature in a Cartesian sense, right? They are principles according to which nature operates. They determine the operations of nature, and sophisticated, mature science will be able to discover what these laws of nature are and use them for scientific explanations of the ordinary phenomena. So on this model, finite modes interact with one another against the background of infinite modes, right? So finite modes exert causal force on one another, and the explanation for why they produce the phenomena they produce, why they produce the effects they produce, must advert to infinite modes understood, as Curley does, as laws of nature in a roughly Cartesian sense. The second view is what I call a Baconian or formalist reading. And I take this from this Walter Ott paper, this 2017 paper. it's not important for us. I'm not going to talk about Bacon after this, so we don't need to complicate this even further. This reading places Spinoza in some ways closer to the Aristotelian tradition, right? So it doesn't say that for Spinoza, this reading says that Spinoza has a view of the laws of nature that is similar to Francis Bacon's. And so it argues that Francis Bacon has an understanding of laws of nature that is in some ways more similar to the Aristotelian model than it is to what will be the emerging Cartesian model. And here is why. So according to the formalist reading, it's the natures of things, or what Bacon and arguably Spinoza sometimes as well refers to as their forms that sort of constitute or ground the laws of nature. So notice the difference here, right? So on the concurrentist reading, the laws of nature are separate from, are distinct from, and govern and regulate finite things, right? Tables, chairs, human beings, plants. On the Baconian formalist reading, the laws are, as it were, local to things, right? So the laws, right? So what describes or regulates the behavior of human beings understood as physical systems are located in or are constituted by or just are the human being's nature itself. And so here, on the Baconian formalist reading, we'll have the physical world will be populated by many distinct things, each of which has its own natures or forms or its own laws. There will be no universal laws that govern everything, homogeneously without exception. And so on the Baconian formalist reading, Spinoza's understanding of laws is more similar to this, as I call it, formalist understanding than it is to the Cartesian or concurrentist view. Now, I haven't yet, of course, presented any evidence either way for what Spinoza might think, but that is coming up in a second. So, before maybe I'll just go, I'll begin with what I intended to start later with. There seems to be evidence in Spinoza for both readings. The long and short of it is, and just in the talk today, I decided to just present one passage where, puzzlingly, it seems that Spinoza is somehow alluding to both, right? So in the TTP, in the chapter 4, which is on the nature of law, not just laws of nature, but what Spinoza also calls human law. We don't need to think about that for now. Spinoza says that a law which depends on the necessity of nature is one which follows necessarily from the very nature or definition of a thing. This seems to be squarely within the Baconian camp, right? So here, Spinoza perhaps following, or at least like Bacon, seems to say that what it is to be a law, right, or where laws are located, the way we should think about laws involves the nature or definitions of things. It's the natures of things that fix the ways that those things operate. It's not a set of, distinct laws that operate, as it were, on a higher level, governing the entirety of nature. Rather, it's the nature or definition of something that explains what that thing does under what circumstances. And yet, later on in the passage, Spinoza goes on to say, for example, it is a universal law of all bodies, which follows from a necessity of nature, that a body which strikes against another lesser body loses as much of its motion as it communicates to the other body. Now, I'm not going to argue here that there is no way to incorporate this within a formalist Baconian reading, but this example, it just strikes one as much more plausibly related to a Cartesian concurrentist understanding, right? So in this passage, it seems that Spinoza is sort of supporting both views of what laws are, at least is sort of not really making a distinction between the two. In contraposition to this passage, now, to refer back to the first, to the top part of the slide, it seems that there are also problems for both readings. So not only does there seem to be evidence for both readings in Spinoza, there are also problems for both of them as well. So problems for the Cartesian reading. First, it's unclear how laws of nature would operate, according to Spinoza, if laws of nature are understood in the Cartesian sense. In a famous set of propositions in part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza claims flatly that all effects of whatever is infinite must themselves be infinite, right? So in other words, if you have something that is infinite, whether it be God or an infinite mode, the effects of that thing, right, what things that thing causes, cannot be finite. They must themselves be infinite. But if that's right, then it's unclear how, if infinite modes are the laws of nature, how could they enter into explanations of the way that finite things, in the way that finite things causally interact, where presumably effects would not be infinite, but finite. Elsewhere, Spinoza seems to refer to local activity. I won't go over that now. But to the third point, Spinoza, in various places, seems to think of the whole of nature as one infinite individual, right? And here it seems that the problem the way that this isn't entirely consistent with the Cartesian reading is that it seems that Spinoza is thinking of infinite things in the same way as he's thinking of finite things, right? So finite things and infinite things are both individuals, are both things. Infinite modes or infinite things, at least in this example, don't seem to be these laws of nature that are not themselves things, but govern things, as it were, on a more Cartesian model. I mean, just to sort of fill out this view, remember that for Descartes, the laws of nature are ultimately pronouncements of God for how physical nature is to operate. None of this seems right. I mean, there are other reasons why this couldn't be right for Spinoza, but in this particular context, this doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem to be the way that Spinoza is thinking about an infinite mode. On the other hand, problems for the Baconian reading, right? Spinoza seems to accept a nomological order of nature, which again is the idea that nature as a whole is governed or regulated by laws that apply in the same way or homogeneously everywhere without exception. And this seems to be much more, this points much more in the direction of a Cartesian reading than it does of what I call the Baconian formalist reading. Paired with this is Spinoza's sort of seemingly straightforward acceptance of mechanist explanation for the way that physical nature operates. Spinoza's sort of laws of mechanics seem very similar to Descartes'. They are, arguably versions, not the same, but versions of Descartes'. And again, it seems like the picture of physical nature that Spinoza is giving us, both sort of at the mechanical level and at the level of the nomological order, in some sense, fits better with a Cartesian reading than it does with a Baconian reading. Okay, so that's the problem, right? The problem of laws of nature in Spinoza. And now here's the part where I wheel in sort of a different theme or notion in Spinoza, Mereology, which I think can help us sort of make headway on this problem, right? So my question here will be, I will try to motivate the idea that Spinoza's mereological principles can help reconcile a Baconian reading with the Cartesian conception, with a Cartesian conception. But we should really think that ultimately it's the Baconian reading that wins out. So I will say for Spinoza, laws of nature are not separate from individuals. They're not, to use this kind of disembodied, separate from individual natures, right? But at the same time, laws of nature do govern all of nature. There are laws of nature that govern the entirety of physical nature. And the way we're able to have both of these, so the way we're able to have a Baconian reading of what laws of nature are, together with sort of a Cartesian understanding of the way the role of laws of nature in physical nature, I'm going to suggest, has to do with principles in Spinoza's Mereology. So, Mereology plays an important role in Spinoza's physical science. The physical science itself is not particularly sophisticated. Its scholars have recognized it's not particularly well developed. This is by Spinoza's own admission in a late letter. But the sort of principles that it gives us do seem to be ones that Spinoza is committed to, right? So Spinoza talks about how in his physical science, about how individuals are distinguished by a particular ratio of motion and rest, not by reason of substance. Remember, of course, for Spinoza, there's one substance, God, and finite things, the things of ordinary experience are not substances. But importantly, individuals can be composed of other individuals, right? So individuals can, through, it seems, sort of causal collaboration by causing a single effect, or elsewhere Spinoza says, by communicating motion and rest to one another, right? So by instantiating a particular pattern of motion and rest, individuals, finite individuals, can compose further individual. So here we have an idea of finite individuals as parts and some rules that determine when certain parts constitute a greater whole. Now, the reason I think this can help us in the debate on the laws of nature is that Spinoza, again, tantalizingly, suggests that the entirety of physical nature is a single whole that includes within it all other physical things as parts. And this comes out especially in sort of a early to mid-career, as it were, letter, the famous letter 32, that Spinoza writes to Henry Oldenburg. So I'm going to turn to this letter now. So in this letter, the purpose of this letter is, among other things, for Spinoza's purpose in this letter is to tell us not, what the parts of nature are that are, that ultimately compose or comprise the entirety of nature, but how we should think of the principles that hold together different finite things as parts, and those parts and the whole that they compose. So Spinoza asks us to imagine a small, as an example, he asks us to imagine there's a small worm living in a bloodstream somewhere, and suppose my bloodstream. I tend to think of my blood as a single individual, right? So when I look at my blood, I think of it as a particular, I tend to think of it as a whole, as a single thing. But Spinoza then says, a worm living in it, if we had a sort of much smaller perspective, right? The point of view of a small creature living in the blood, one that could, he says, distinguish by sight the blood's components, things would appear very different to us, right? So he says that we could consider a worm living in our blood as we live in this part of the universe. And the worm living in our blood would not represent the blood as we do as one single thing. It would rather represent different, what we would think of as the components of the blood, right? The different particles that, according to Spinoza, lymph and chyle, but we shouldn't, we've gone past that at this point. The different particles that make up the blood. So a worm, while we see the blood, the worm would see only the particles, right? And the worm would have no knowledge, Spinoza says, of the blood as a single individual. The worm would only know the components of the blood as themselves, right? Particular, discrete, distinct individuals. And so then Spinoza's move is to say that, as the worm stands to the blood, we stand to the entire universe, right? All bodies in nature, Spinoza writes, can and must be conceived as we have here conceived the blood, for all bodies are surrounded by others and are determined by one another to existing and producing an effect in a fixed, wet, and determinate way, the same ratio of motion to rest, always being preserved in all of them at once, that is, in the whole universe. So the analogy then would be, if we were somehow larger than the universe or the same size as the entirety of nature, of course, an absurdity for Spinoza and for in general, we might be able to see the universe as a single thing, right? But because we are much smaller than the universe, we don't see things that way. We distinguish discrete individuals that are within the universe in the same way that a worm living in our blood might distinguish discrete individuals living within, being present in our bloodstream. Now, why does this help us? Why do I think that this can help us arrive at a better answer to Spinoza's conception of the laws of nature? interestingly, in this letter, Spinoza does not merely say that all of nature is a single individual and that we are parts of nature or that we're within nature. He goes on to say that the whole and the parts are regular, or the whole determines the parts in particular ways, right? So according to Spinoza, insofar as something is a whole, right, it always remains in the same state. So this is the sort of the first column here. If we consider the blood a whole, the blood will always remain in the same state, and its particles would undergo no variations other than those which be conceived from the given relation of the motion of the blood to the lymph of the chyle, roughly the ratio of motion and rest that constitutes the blood's nature. So the blood would always have to be considered as a whole and not as a part. So insofar as we, reading here, insofar as we consider the blood as a whole, we consider its particular ratio of motion and rest, and that ratio of motion and rest determines what occurs to the blood and in the blood, right? So if the blood were the only thing that existed, right, the ratio of motion and rest, the nature of the blood, would determine all that happens. Right? Of course, this is not the case for it is the case for the universe, but it's not the case for the blood. The blood has the nature is not only a whole, but is itself a part of a greater whole for Spinoza. And because it's a part of a greater whole, it is subject to other natures as well as its own. So other natures, the natures of external things. I mean, we could think of, other components of the body or atmospheric conditions or what have you, determine what happens to the blood and in the blood, right? So it's not simply the nature of the blood that determines what happens, but it's the nature of things outside of the blood together with the nature of the blood that determines what happens. And importantly, it's the nature, as we'll see, of the whole of which the blood is a part that regulates and regiments what happens to not only the blood itself, but the other things that together with the blood compose or like are parts of this whole. So the second one should say too, but to lay out the view here, right? So first of all, Spinoza is a Baconian, as I've described it earlier, about the nature of the laws, right? So even in letter 32 itself, Spinoza says, by coherence of the parts, I understand nothing but the laws or nature of one part adapt itself to the laws or nature of the other, so that they're opposed to each other as little as possible. So this is a passage that this is the part that gives us what's which Spinoza says tells us how we should understand when something composes a larger whole. But in this passage, Spinoza refers to the laws or nature of things, right? The nature of things determines or constitutes laws. And yet, within this picture, right, Spinoza also says that the whole regiments and governs the way that the parts operate. So Spinoza says the worm could not know how all the parts of the blood are regulated by the universal nature of the blood and are compelled to adapt themselves to one another as the universal nature of the blood requires, so that they agree with one another in a definite way. So let's understand what's happening here. The blood as a whole has a particular nature for Spinoza, has a particular ratio of motion and rest. That is sort of, you might think, put into place by the parts that are moving and resting within the blood. But the ratio of motion and rest of the whole structures, determines, restricts what its parts can or cannot do. And so the nature of the whole is, as it were, governing the natures of its parts, right? It's limiting them in particular ways. It's limiting them to behave and to vary only in ways that are consistent with the nature of the whole itself. And so here I think we have a kind of governing model, right, that is put into place by this part-whole relation that Spinoza is pointing us to in letter 32, right? So everything, insofar as it has in nature, has its own laws, but the content of those laws, right, is determined by, what whole a particular thing is part of. A part cannot have, at least in letter 32 for Spinoza, a part cannot have laws that contradict the nature of the whole, that would lead the nature of the whole to destruction. the laws instead of the parts are regulated or compelled by the whole to behave in a particular way by which the whole is maintained. Okay, so this leads us to, and I'll pick up the pace here a little bit, the nested natures model that I sort of described above. We can think of the whole of nature as to put it roughly, we can think of the whole of nature for Spinoza as a discrete single individual, physical individual, whose ratio of motion and rest is unchanging, because there's no other individual, there's no whole of which it is a part, and by which its ratio of motion and rest, or alternatively, its nature or laws, could be regulated. This single whole regulates, right, determines, compels the natures of the parts that compose it. And so these parts behave in ways, their laws are local to a certain extent, right? The explanations for why things occur, or the explanations for the phenomena that involve them, advert to the laws that are contained within their natures, but those laws themselves are regulated and restricted by the laws of the whole of which they're parts. And all of this sort of repeats itself, as it were, all the way down, right? So nature is a single infinite whole with an infinity of parts, each of which has discrete laws of nature on the one hand, but whose discrete laws of nature are structured and regimented by sort of the wholes, again, going back up to the, up the hierarchy, by the wholes of which they are parts. Okay, so that's the model that I wanted to propose for how to sort of reconcile or explain how Spinoza might be a Baconian about the laws of nature, but a Cartesian about the way that laws of nature work. There are problems with this view, and problems that, as I suggested before, ultimately I've not been able to resolve. So I'm going to go quickly through the problems so I can get to the potential solutions, which I think are maybe more interesting. So, the first problem is that it's unclear. I mean, there's a disagreement about this, but it's unclear whether Spinoza thinks of mereological relations as real. He sometimes refers to them as beings of reason, in particular in his earlier works. Beings of reason for Spinoza are not, are distinguished from real beings. They are, roughly sort of ideas of the mind that are helpful to the mind to understand the way things operate in nature, but ideas that don't themselves, whose content doesn't itself correspond to anything occurring in nature. Worse, in the Ethics, so in his more mature work, Spinoza seems to say that it is from the imagination alone. So what for Spinoza is a sort of lesser kind, or a kind of knowledge with a lesser pedigree. It's from the imagination alone that we divide things into parts. If we were able to represent things from the intellect, right? So from the way that God represents things, according to Spinoza, if we were able to represent things from the intellect, we wouldn't, Spinoza seems to suggest, speak of parts and wholes. We would just speak about simple things. We would just speak about individuals. But what is perhaps a worse problem for NNM, as I called it, is Spinoza's views on the priority of the part. So in a few letters, just 6 months after writing this letter to Oldenburg, where he talks about the worm in the blood and the mereological structure of nature as a whole, Spinoza flatly says that God is simple and not composed of parts. For component parts must be prior in nature and knowledge to what is composed of them. Right? And it being eternal by its nature, this cannot be. So here, the takeaway here is that if we understand parts as composing a whole for Spinoza, it seems, at least from this passage, Spinoza is supports a traditional view on which you have to understand what the parts are before understanding what the whole is, or equivalently, the nature of the whole is determined by the nature of its parts. But as we just saw in letter 32, I'm not sure, honestly, whether this is a problem with my reading of Spinoza or whether Spinoza himself is a little bit inconsistent, seems to say things are a little inconsistent here. This understanding of what this particular understanding of what parts and wholes are, where the parts are prior to the whole, doesn't seem reconcilable with the picture of nature as a single whole that structures and governs all of its parts in the way that I described earlier. On that picture of nature, it seems the whole would have to be prior to its parts. We couldn't understand the content of the nature of the parts, or what the nature of the parts is, without first understanding what the nature of the whole is. And so to get to the, the second column, there's NNM, the nested natures model, seems to presuppose a kind of top-down determination, as I was describing just now, one that appears to be inconsistent with thinking that parts are prior to wholes, as Spinoza also says in, just 6 months after writing this letter. Okay, so in the time that remains, I'm going to sketch very briefly two solutions, and then I'll leave this as a kind of mystery, or as a exercise for the reader or for the viewer to solve, right? So how can we, if the nested natures model is in any way compelling, I think it has some good things going for it. How can we reconcile it with Spinoza's views of how mereological relations operate, in particular, the priority of the part with respect to the whole? One possibility is that Spinoza thinks that there are multiple mereological relations, right? So there's mereological relations themselves come in different sorts, and perhaps these different sorts of mereological relations are sort of operate differently. So there's some textual evidence for this that I was able to find in the Cogitata Metafisica, in sort of a early to mid-career work. Spinoza distinguishes between three different kinds of composition. Composition of substances, so when substances come together and form a new substance. Composition of modes, when modes come together and form a new mode. And then what he calls compositions of reason, which we can sort of forget about for now. But the point here is that Spinoza is distinguishing between what he calls substantial composition and modal composition. The passages that I presented earlier, where Spinoza says that the part is prior to the whole, all occur, at least to the best of my knowledge, with the context within which they occur is one in which Spinoza is focusing on substances. So in other words, it's when Spinoza is talking about substance. So for him, of course, there can be no substantial composition, because there's only one substance. But beyond that, right, substantial composition cannot. There can be no substantial composition, God cannot be composed, because we would have to understand the parts of God as prior in nature and understanding to God itself, which is anathema to Spinoza's metaphysics. This leaves open the possibility that modal composition for Spinoza is, in modal composition, perhaps the whole comes before the part. So these would be the two mereological relations that I sort of was alluding to earlier. Perhaps for Spinoza, again, in substantial composition, the parts come before the whole, but in modal composition, perhaps the wholes might come before the parts. The problem with this solution is that I just don't think there's any, at least to the best of my knowledge, there's no textual evidence that Spinoza, in fact, thought that these two different kinds of composition differed in this way. I mean, there's nowhere, I think, where Spinoza says that in modal composition, it's not the case if the part becomes for the whole. And we might expect him to say this if he in fact distinguished these two types of relations in this way. And elsewhere, Spinoza, when Spinoza does talk about modal composition in the Ethics and in his political works, they seem very similar to sort of what substantial composition, where the parts come before the whole, where the nature of the parts come before the nature of the whole, and the whole must be understood through its parts. This is true, arguably, of the essence of the human mind for Spinoza, which is the mind is composed of discrete ideas. But even more so, perhaps, Spinoza in his political works arguably says that, holds a view that states are individuals composed of parts, of which you and I would feature prominently, human beings feature prominently. But it sort of strains credibility to think that, the nature of a state, it must be understood before the nature of the human beings and other parts by which a state is composed. So modal composition, it really seems for Spinoza, does operate according to the same parts before wholes logic, or parts before wholes structure, as substantial composition does. The second tentative solution, and perhaps this is more interesting, is that Spinoza is not talking about, so in the letter, contrary to what it might seem, in the letter on in which a worm in the blood features, in the letter on parts and wholes, Spinoza isn't talking about mereological parts and wholes or mereological division, but another kind of division, sort of what we might refer to as a logical division. And there's some evidence for, for example, in the Port Royal Logic written by Arnaud and Nicole, Arnaud and Nicole distinguish explicitly between what we might call a mereological classification, which is the one roughly we've been speaking about so far, where the parts are part of the whole. They distinguish mereological classification from logical classification, which you might think of more as on a model of genus and species, right? So a logical classification is one where a whole has what they call subjective parts that are included in its extension. So, for example, animal is sort of genus concept, and cat and dog are species concepts, and they're logically related because cat and dog are ways of being an animal, right? Importantly, we have to understand the nature of animal before we understand the nature of cat or dog. So the nature of a cat or dog includes the nature of what it is to be an animal. This gives us, it seems, and I'll be brief here. This gives us, it seems, the correct order of priority from wholes to parts. But the problem, and I'd be happy to talk about this in Q&A, is that it just doesn't seem that logical classification is the right kind of relation to describe physical nature in Spinoza. Very briefly, logical classification comes with a set of rules Arnaud and Nicole specify that it seems, and I'm happy to describe this more during Q&A, it seems not to be reconcilable with the way that Spinoza is talking about physical nature. Okay, so I think that is, I'm going to skip to something else bit and thank my audience for coming with me through this sort of explanation, through this talk. And thank you all for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Leonardo. That was definitely very, very stimulating. I'm going to stop the recording now, but let me thank you once again for being part of this, everybody.